Ladies and gentlemen, I know that there are some men watching my videos, especially this unit on Alzheimer's, because it's one of the diseases that gets the attention of both males and females alike. This is video number 238, the third in the unit on Alzheimer's. And while all of chapter 33 in my book, both first and second edition, is on Alzheimer's, there is no way I can show you in my book what I can show you here. The reason this video is so important is because you determine whether your brain builds up or breaks down, and you know it will tie into many of the future videos. So this video is entitled How Your Brain Builds Up and Breaks Down. So let's use the analogy of a building to understand how important it is to build up your brain and how the quality of your building determines whether or not it will break down. Are you familiar with the story of the three little pigs? It's a children's fairy tale, but there's great wisdom in it, and we're going to use it for our discussion today. Whenever you build something, you start with a basic building block, right? Well, in the story of the three little pigs, the first little pig started with straw. The second little pig started with sticks. And the third little pig started with bricks. Well, in the case of your brain, you start with a neuron. So this is a neuron, and you start with just one neuron. So step one of building your brain is to get a new item of building material. That means that step one of building your brain is to form a new neuron. If we were to make a chart of the buildup and breakdown of your brain compared to the houses of the three little pigs thus far, it would look like this. Here you see the beginnings of the chart we'll use to depict the steps of brain buildup and brain breakdown. In the far left column, you see pig 1, pig 2, pig 3, and your brain. For the three little pigs, step 1 is to gather the building material. And you see that for pig 1, it was straw, for pig 2, it was sticks, and for pig 3, it was bricks. For your brain, it's formation of a new neuron. Then, once you have the basic building block, you start building by connecting two pieces of your building material, right? So this is what constitutes step 2 of building. The first little pig connected his building materials by bunching up a bunch of straw and then just tying a rope around them. And the second little pig just stacked and leaned sticks against each other. He didn't go so far as to hammer in a few nails also. And the third little pig carefully stacked and staggered his bricks and then cemented them together. In the case of your brain, two neurons connect. So, what happens in your brain is that this neuron connects to this neuron. And you learned in the last video that once these two neurons connect, they can communicate with one another. And they do that via a neurotransmitter, and that communication between the two is knowledge. So the more you connect one neuron to another, the smarter you get. And once you've made the connection and two neurons communicate with one another, you can use that knowledge over and over again. That constitutes memory. You aren't changing the information or learning anything new. You're just reusing what you already know. The longer and more frequently you utilize this knowledge, the stronger it gets. But the actual learning only occurs when you make the first connection. But instead of just this one neuron connecting to just this other neuron, there's a chain reaction as you learn more and more. So this neuron connects to this neuron, and this neuron connects to this neuron. So now you have 3 neurons. And notice, though, that thus far, the connections are all linear. Each neuron only connects with the next neuron. You only have communication between neurons that are lined up in single file. So here's how this looks on our chart. Now you see step 2 filled in. Pig 1 bunched up his straw and tied it with a rope. Pig 2 stacked sticks and nailed them. Pig 3 stacked and staggered his bricks and then cemented them together. And the connected neurons in your brain gave you the ability to learn something new and then remember it to use it later. Now for step 3 of building, insulation. Now, I'm no builder, and I know very little about building materials. So nothing I say about the straw, sticks, or bricks is credible. But what I say about your brain is. In any case, the first little pig used straw, which, as I understand, actually does have some insulating properties. So we're going to give that pig the benefit of the doubt and let his house stand for now. And apparently, wood, especially when converted into wood shavings, is also a pretty good insulator. So the stick house of the second little pig gets to remain standing too. So the straw and the stick are still standing. And the third little pig's house of brick was carefully insulated. It even had a fireplace and a chimney. So it was definitely sturdy enough to pass the insulation step of the building process. The insulation step of building your brain has to do with the speed at which you are able to connect neurons and retrieve memories from them. The more you connect consecutive neurons and the more you try to retrieve information from them, the more electrical activity there is between these connected neurons. You know, there are a lot of things in your body that involve electricity. And your heart has electrical currents. Your fluid and electrolyte balance has electrical currents. Your muscles have electrical currents. And now you know that your brain has electrical currents. So, well, anytime there is electricity involved, you need insulation, right? So, to insulate the neurons in your brain, you build a fatty myelin sheath around them to coat them. This is our fatty myelin sheath. And by wrapping it around the neurons and protecting them, what you do is end up insulating them. And the fatty myelin sheath allows your brain to work faster and more efficiently without overloading the circuit, just like insulation. So you are able to connect more neurons and retrieve the stored information from them faster. Insulation is all about efficiency. So the third step in building your brain pertains to the insulation that enables you to think quickly and efficiently. Now, if you recall the last video entitled, It's All a Matter of Gray and White, I taught you that the gray matter is your neurons and the connections between them. And the white matter is the fatty myelin coating that surrounds your neurons to insulate them. So all we've addressed thus far is how you build your brain with regard to your gray matter and your white matter. So let's put this on our chart. So pig 1 has his straw insulation, pig 2 has his wood shavings, and pig 3 has his bricks and fireplace. While your brain has your white matter, which constitutes fatty myelin. Okay, step 4 in the building process involves something called cross connections. This pertains to anything that connects parts that are not directly in contact with one another. In the case of a house, it's the means of connecting one wall to the next wall. It's the corners. So pig 1 just took a rope and tied it around the straw. All that did was keep the straw in a great big pile. It did absolutely nothing to create any cross connections. So, without cross connections, the straw house was unable to withstand the blow of the big bad wolf. And that's why it crumbled when the big bad wolf huffed and puffed to blow his house down. Pig 2 used sticks. And the story doesn't specify as to whether or not he bothered to make notches in the ends of the sticks that connected 2 walls together. If you build with sticks, you need to make sure that they're like Lincoln logs. They need to lock at the corners. We'll give the second pig the benefit of the doubt and assume that he used the Lincoln log design. So when the wolf huffed and puffed, it didn't blow his house down. So we're going to let the stick house remain standing for now. And as for the third little pig, we all know that his brick house was sturdy enough to withstand the blow of the big bad wolf. His corners consisted of bricks that cross-linked the long edge of one brick with the short edge of the adjacent brick in alternating fashion. So we know that the brick house remained standing. Well, the fourth step in building our brain involves cross connections too. In step 2, I said that each neuron only communicates with the next neuron in line, right? But as you continue to build your brain and you add more neurons to your brain, what happens is that there are connections not just between neighboring neurons, but across neurons. So the fatty myelin sheath insulation enables you to create cross connections so that there is communication with neurons other than just the 2 consecutive neighboring neurons. Instead of one neuron communicating with just one other neuron, it's as if the neurons can all communicate with each other. So this neuron starts connecting and communicating with this neuron. And this neuron starts connecting and cross-communicating with this neuron, etc., etc., etc. You get all kinds of communication in every direction all over the board. And when you have all that cross-communication, you have a much bigger and more complex network. Well, the larger and more complex the network, the smarter you are. In essence, you've built a better brain. These cross connections between distant neurons enable you to connect concepts that are not directly related to one another. It allows you to see relationships between things that are not obvious. For example, with cross connections between your neurons, you were able to deduce that if estrogen loss causes bone loss, then estrogen replacement would prevent bone loss. Cross connections make it possible for you to draw conclusions by applying basic principles to different things. This is one of the reasons I tell you to watch my videos in order. So the more connections you have between neurons and the more fatty myelin you have around them, the more you build up your brain and the stronger it gets. That translates into intelligence. The more cross connections you have, the smarter you are. So here's our brailled up and breakdown chart again. So here's where you see that the way the first little pig chose to build his house could not withstand the blows. So there's a big X in the cell for breakdown in the row for pig 1. And if you build your brain like the first little pig built his house, failing to do anything to build cross connections, your brain will start breaking down here too. But pig 2 chose to link his logs, which made his house stronger so that it withstood the blows. And pig 3 chose to use bricks, which were the strongest of all and didn't feel the blows at all. In the row for your brain, you see that this step enables you to make relationships between unrelated things, and that makes you smarter. Step 5 in the building process involves something very interesting. In medical terminology, it's called bilateralization. Now, whenever you hear a big, long word like that, just break it up into parts to figure out its meaning. Bilateralization has 3 parts. Bi means 2. Lateral means side. Ization means the act or process of doing something. In the case of the first little pig, this is irrelevant. His house has already been destroyed. There's no hope for continued building. For the second little pig, it addresses whether he used long logs that extend from one end of his house to the other, or he used short logs that didn't make it all the way across. Well, even if he used Lincoln logs with locking corners, we know that most of his sticks were just kind of stacked up and leaned against one another. So his sticks were probably too short to reach both sides of his house. And that is precisely what led to the demise of his house. When the wolf huffed and puffed, his house did not have enough bilateralization to withstand the blow. So this is the step that doomed the second little pig's house. The third little pig made continuous, strong rows of bricks that extended from one side of his house to the other. That's bilateralization. So his house is still standing after the wolf huffs and puffs to blow it down. His remains standing. In the case of your brain, bilateralization means the act or process of using both sides of your brain. To demonstrate it, we're going to use a different prop. You see this brain model? Notice that the brain has 2 sides, 2 hemispheres, right and left. Anatomically, they're called hemispheres, and they divide your brain into the right and left sides, or right and left hemispheres. Now, there have always been a lot of misconceptions about the functions of the right and left sides of the brain. One of the most common misconceptions is that they are mirror images of one another, and both participate equally in your thought processes. Another is that the 2 sides have different functions, with your left hemisphere controlling speech, language, logic, including math and science, and your right hemisphere controlling intuition, face recognition, reading emotional cues, as well as creativity and art. But which side of your brain you use more is much more complicated than that, actually. And in this series on Alzheimer's, I'll teach you about the 2 sides of your brain with regard to how they handle aging and how they are affected by Alzheimer's. Notice that there is a wall between the 2 sides of this brain. And the name of this wall is called corpus callosum, but I'm just going to call it the wall. Now, you usually think of walls as structures that separate 2 things so that they do not work together. But here's the great thing. If you really build your brain with more and more knowledge, the two separate hemispheres begin to communicate with each other. It's as if you tear down that wall. And once you tear down the wall, you become able to use the other side of your brain that used to remain idle with certain types of thinking. And when that happens, it's like having two entirely separate brains in one head. You're able to use both sides of your brain instead of just one side. That makes you even smarter. So if I go back to our neuron board as a prop, and I have two neuron boards to represent the two sides of your brain, it's as if I can take the two and combine them. And that makes all the neurons in the right side communicate with the neurons in the left side. And that is like having more troops if you're fighting a war. It amounts to being able to recruit alternative brain cells to do work that they aren't normally able to do. It makes you a whole lot smarter. So the fifth step in building your brain is being able to use both sides of your brain instead of just one. And here's how that looks on our chart. So now you see that Pig 1's house is long gone. Pig 2's house bites the dust at this stage of building and cannot advance further. Pig 3's house is still standing and can continue to improve if he maintains it. And in the row for your brain, I've written two brains in one head to reflect the fact that this one step is a huge advancement in terms of your intelligence. The sixth step in brain building is what I call ruts. And we won't be addressing ruts at all with regard to the houses of the pig number 1 and pig number 2, because they are long gone. But we do need to address the ruts for the third little pig. Now, I really had to stretch my imagination for this one. Ruts refer to a surface that is not flat. Instead, it's a surface that has elevations and depressions that alter the contour. And the result is that the surface area of the overall structure is greater than it would be if it were flat. So for the third little pig's house, I'm going to point out that the roof of his house was shingled. It was a series of convolutions resulting in a larger surface area than it would have if it were completely flat. When it comes to your brain, the sixth step in brain building has to do with ruts too. Have you ever noticed how wrinkled the surface of a brain is? The wrinkles are ruts. Here I have a smooth piece of material, nice and smooth. And here I have a wrinkled piece of material. Now, if you measure these, you will discover that the ruddy, wrinkled material is larger than the smooth material. Why? Because the ruts constitute more surface area. Well, all those ruts in your brain mean that your brain's surface area is much larger than the size of your actual brain. And the more ruts your brain has, the smarter you are. So, the more you increase the depth of your brain ruts, the better. More ruts and deeper ruts build up your brain into a stronger, smarter brain. So here's our chart. The houses of the first and second little pig are gone. But the brick house of the third little pig is still around because of the shingled roof. And your brain is still building up because of all those ruts. Now for the seventh step in building of any kind of building. Density. Density means weight. The more dense something is, the heavier it is. In the case of the third little pig's house, bricks are heavy. So are shingles. So his house was very dense and heavy, which is why it withstood the wolf's huffing and puffing. In the case of your brain, the more you build up your brain, the more dense it becomes and the heavier it gets. Density refers to brain size, weight, and volume. And simply put, the bigger your brain, the better. Now, I like to think that head size is not a reflection of brain size. More specifically, I like to think it's not a reflection of intelligence. But the only reason I say that is because I have an abnormally small head. Really, I do. I wear children's glasses. I have to insert 2 hat pins into every hat to keep any hat on my tiny head. And I always have the smallest head in any photo involving other adults. I even had a child look at a photo of me with both children and adults and ask me, "Barbie, why is your head so small?" So I don't want to believe that a small head is indicative of a small brain or decreased intelligence. But I'm probably wrong about that. In any case, the typical adult brain weighs about 1,400 grams, which is about 3 pounds. But the more you build up your brain, the more it weighs. And the heavier your brain, the smarter you are. So, this brain has a higher density than this brain. It is bigger and heavier. Now, this brings up something that has always been a quandary for me. I just told you that the more dense your brain, the smarter you are. But if you look up the word dense in the dictionary, one of its meanings is stupid or slow-witted. And that's precisely the opposite of what you are if you have a dense brain. Tisk, tisk, tisk. I just don't understand words that contradict themselves, but maybe that's because I have a very small, non-dense brain. The key, though, is to understand these things that contribute to a brain that is big and dense. I used the very same example in one of the videos on osteoporosis, and later you'll discover that the repetition is intentional. Density matters whether you're talking about your bones or your brain. So let's put that on our chart. Once again, you see X's for the first and second little pig, but the third pig used heavy bricks and heavy, rutted shingles that made his house strong. It's still standing. And if you continue to build up your brain, the result is that it will become more dense, larger, and smarter. Okay, there's just one last step in brain buildup and brain breakdown. Step 8 is the cumulative effect of all of the preceding steps. It's the bonus for continuing to build your brain properly and diligently. It's the ultimate reason that the third little pig's house was able to withstand the huffing and puffing of the big bad wolf. It's the real reason his house didn't blow down. The brick house had all the individual elements that gave it the extra strength and resilience to withstand the blows. Cumulatively, building steps 1 through 7 all contributed to keep it standing. Of course, no one in the world of brain science is going to refer to your brain's ability to withstand a blow as analogous to the houses of the 3 little pigs. But they will describe the same thing using different terminology. Instead of talking about houses of straw, sticks, and bricks, they'll use a term called cognitive reserve to describe a brain that stays as opposed to one that decays. Cognition is the process of thinking. Cognitive reserve is maintenance of your ability to use your brain productively. Think of cognitive reserve as strength or resilience. Cognitive reserve is a reservoir of strength that protects your brain when it is assaulted by things that would damage it if it didn't have cognitive reserve. Cognitive reserve is extra brain power. More brain power can help you ward off diseases of your brain. Cognitive reserve is like immunity. It enables your brain to function normally even when it's under attack by various kinds of invaders. And in later videos on management options for preventing Alzheimer's, you'll discover that cognitive reserve is very important. Another word for cognitive reserve is neuroplasticity. That's one you might have heard before. The two terms amount to the same thing. So, the brick house had cognitive reserve, while the straw and stick houses didn't. We can demonstrate cognitive reserve or neuroplasticity for your brain by using saran wrap. It's a form of protection against the elements. So, cognitive reserve is like having saran wrap around the brain so that it can protect the brain. And of course, we'll put saran wrap around the third little pig's house too. This stuff is hard to use. You gotta really yank on it. So, the third little pig's house gets saran wrapped also. So if you've accomplished all 7 steps of building up your brain, you can have the benefit of cognitive reserve. It's the bonus. But you have to go through all 7 steps to get the bonus of cognitive reserve. It's the wrapper after all the other materials are already there. It's like a windbreaker. It helps your brain withstand the blows of the big bad wolf. So, the more neurons you have, and the more connections you have between neurons, and the more fatty myelin insulation you have covering and insulating those neurons, and the more cross connections and complexity of the network, and the more the right side of your brain communicates with the left side of your brain, and the more ruts your brain has, and the bigger and heavier your brain is, the more cognitive reserve your brain has. And if we were to compare these 2 brains with regard to the number of neurons, the connections between neurons, the quantity of fatty myelin insulation, the number of cross connections, the degree of communication between the right and left sides of the brains, the depth of their ruts and their weights, the larger brain would win on all counts. So here's our chart. So now you see that both the brick house and your brain will have cognitive reserve if you build them using steps 1 through 7 that precede it. So the brick house stays while the straw and stick houses decay. And this little fairy tale is an excellent analogy for how you build your brain. There is some irony in it, though. My father used to always tell my brother that he was hard-headed. He used the word hard-headed in a derogatory way. He meant that my brother was stubborn and unwilling to consider new ideas. But using this analogy of the 3 pigs' houses, with the brick house being the hardest and the strongest, maybe there's something good about being hard-headed. I'll have to tell my brother that. And that's because how you build your brain will determine whether it stays or decays when it receives blows. So I've shown you multiple steps in how your brain builds itself up. They range from the individual neurons to the whole sum total of your brain's density. Now, why are all these things so important? Well, it's because how you build up your brain matters, and it matters a lot. So far in this video, I've described all the things that contribute to make your brain bigger, denser, and stronger, and smarter. They all constitute various aspects of building up your brain. Well, what's the opposite of all that? It's breaking down of your brain. And that includes all types of dementia, which we will address in video 241, 2 weeks from now. And brain breakdown is the reverse of what I've described thus far. It includes loss or absence of cognitive reserve, loss of brain density, loss of ruts on the surface of your brain, lack of communication between the two sides of your brain, loss of communication between distant neurons, loss of the fatty myelin insulation that surrounds the neurons, loss of communication between individual neurons via neurotransmitters, and cessation of new neuron formation. The end result is brain breakdown. And that's what this unit will teach you to avoid. This is where I'll stop today, because if this brain breakdown did occur, it's where anyone would stop. Next week, I'll present the different kinds of memory. It will bring you one step closer to understanding Alzheimer's. Be sure to schedule a consultation if you want or need one. Just go to menopausetaylor.me. Subscribe and get all your friends to do the same. Follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Bye!